One man, one ideology, one revolution, a legacy the world still cannot agree on. Few people have remained as powerful in memory as Ernesto Che Guevara. To some, he was the embodiment of courage. To others, a symbol of ruthless revolution. More than half a century after his death, his face is still recognized across continents. But behind the famous photograph was a man far more human and far more contradictory than the legend that followed him. He was a doctor who chose war, a revolutionary who believed history could be changed by the barrel of a gun, a government minister who walked away from power in search of another revolution, and finally, a wounded prisoner in a small Bolivian schoolhouse, waiting for the end. Tonight, we leave the icon behind and follow the remarkable journey of the man who became one of history's most enduring and most debated symbols. On the morning of October 9th, 1967, the mountain air around the tiny Bolivian village of La Higuera was unusually still. Outside a modest rural schoolhouse, soldiers stood guard with rifles resting quietly against their shoulders. Inside, sitting on the floor of a simple classroom, was Ernesto Che Guevara. His clothes were torn. His boots were covered with mud from days of exhausting marches through the Bolivian wilderness. His hands were bound. Asthma made every breath slow and heavy. Only a few years earlier, he had commanded revolutionary columns that helped bring down the government of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. He had addressed diplomats at the United Nations, negotiated with foreign leaders, and served as one of the most influential figures in the Cuban Revolution. Now there were no cheering crowds, no speeches, no revolutionary banners, only silence, only soldiers, and the growing certainty that he would never leave the village alive. The Bolivian government was already preparing the story it intended the world to hear. Officially, Ernesto Guevara would die in combat, but the evidence pointed toward something very different. He had been captured alive the previous day after being wounded during a firefight in the Quebrada del Euro. Soon afterward, orders arrived from La Paz. There would be no public trial, no opportunity for him to speak, no courtroom that might turn into a political stage. He was to be executed. Several of the captured guerrillas would suffer the same fate. It is an ending that has been retold so many times that it almost feels detached from reality, as though the legend somehow created the man who came before it. But legends rarely begin where they end. Long before Bolivia, before Cuba, before the famous photograph, before the military fatigues and the black beret, there was simply a young Argentine medical student trying to understand why so many people across Latin America seemed to live lives marked by poverty, inequality, and forgotten promises. The journey that transformed him was neither sudden nor inevitable. It unfolded slowly, through illness, through books, through endless conversations, through difficult choices, through journeys across mountains and deserts, through revolutions both successful and failed, and through an unwavering belief that history could be forced to change. Few historical figures remain as deeply divided in public memory as Che Guevara. For many, he represents resistance against imperialism and solidarity with the oppressed. For others, he symbolizes political intolerance, revolutionary violence, and the dangerous certainty that noble ideals can justify ruthless methods. Neither image tells the whole story. The real Ernesto Guevara lived somewhere between them. He looked at the dictatorships, foreign intervention, and crushing poverty that shaped much of 20th century Latin America, and became convinced that ordinary political reform would never be enough. Yet he also came to believe that violence was not merely unavoidable, but necessary. It was a conviction that would shape every major decision he made for the rest of his life. His story asks us to do something more difficult than simply admire or condemn. It asks us to understand, to follow the path that carried him from Argentina to Guatemala, from Guatemala to Mexico, from the mountains of the Sierra Maestra to the streets of Havana, from government offices to distant battlefields in Africa, and finally to the isolated valleys of Bolivia, where both the man and the myth would meet their end. Along the way, we encounter questions that remain surprisingly modern. How does compassion become ideology? How does idealism become discipline? How does discipline become intolerance? And how easily can the dream of liberation begin to resemble the very forms of power it once opposed? Those questions cannot be answered by a single photograph. They cannot be answered by a slogan. And they cannot be answered by choosing only one version of Che Guevara. To understand the icon, we first have to understand the man. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928, in the city of Rosario, Argentina. His family belonged to the educated middle class. They were comfortable enough to surround their children with books, conversation, and curiosity, yet unconventional enough to encourage independent thought rather than blind obedience. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, and his mother, Celia de la Serna, shared liberal and anti-clerical views that exposed young Ernesto to politics from an early age. Their home was never a revolutionary headquarters, but neither was it politically silent. The Spanish Civil War, the rise of fascism in Europe, social reform, national identity, economic inequality, these subjects were not distant headlines. They were part of ordinary conversations around the family table. From childhood, however, another struggle shaped Ernesto's life far more personally. Asthma. The illness followed him almost constantly. Some attacks left him struggling for breath through entire nights. For many children, such a condition might have encouraged caution. For Ernesto, it produced something different: determination. He refused to allow his illness to define him. He learned to swim, played rugby despite his breathing difficulties, hiked whenever he could, pushed himself physically in ways that surprised even those closest to him. Friends later remembered that stubbornness long before they remembered his politics. It was a trait that would remain with him for the rest of his life. At the University of Buenos Aires, Ernesto chose to study medicine. The decision reflected genuine curiosity rather than political ambition. Medicine offered a practical way to relieve suffering. It also exposed him to another reality. Disease rarely existed alone. Illness often walked alongside poverty, poor housing, malnutrition, lack of sanitation, neglected communities. The more patients he encountered, the more he began to wonder whether doctors were treating symptoms while society ignored the causes. Yet at this stage, Ernesto was not the disciplined Marxist revolutionary history would later remember. He was still searching. He read philosophy with the same enthusiasm as literature. He explored history alongside poetry. He debated politics without yet belonging completely to any ideology. He was restless, curious, often stubborn, always reading. Argentina itself was changing rapidly during these years. Juan P. Orin was reshaping the country's political landscape through nationalism, organized labor, and mass popular support. Whether one admired or opposed Perón, politics became impossible to ignore. It filled newspapers, factories, universities, family dinners, street demonstrations. The young Ernesto absorbed this atmosphere without simply adopting one political identity. Instead, he developed another habit. Whenever he looked at an individual life, he increasingly asked what larger system had produced it. That question would soon take him far beyond the borders of Argentina. And before long, a single journey across South America would transform curiosity into conviction. By the early 1950s, Ernesto Guevara had almost completed his medical studies. On paper, his future looked reassuringly ordinary. A medical degree promised stability, respect, and a profession that could take him almost anywhere in the world. Yet the young Argentine found himself increasingly distracted by a question that medicine alone could not answer. Why did so many people suffer in the same ways, no matter which country he visited? The question lingered quietly in his mind, and eventually it became impossible to ignore. In December 1951, Ernesto and his close friend Alberto Granado decided to leave Argentina on an aging Norton 500 motorcycle they affectionately called La Poderosa, the Mighty One. The nickname sounded optimistic. The motorcycle itself was anything but. It rattled over rough roads, leaked oil, broke down repeatedly, and often demanded more patience than speed. But perhaps that was part of the journey. Neither man was chasing comfort. They wanted to see South America with their own eyes, rather than through newspapers or university lectures. At first, the expedition felt almost carefree. The two friends laughed often. They camped beneath open skies, accepted meals from strangers, and crossed landscapes that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Snow-covered peaks slowly gave way to dry valleys, vineyards, forests, and the long spine of the Andes. The road itself became their classroom. Every village carried its own rhythm. Every town had its own stories. Yet beneath those differences, Ernesto began noticing familiar patterns. In Chile, they met miners whose lives revolved around exhausting labor beneath the earth. Their work helped produce wealth, but very little of that wealth remained with the people extracting it. Foreign companies dominated much of the industry, while workers endured dangerous conditions and uncertain futures. Ernesto listened more than he spoke. He had always enjoyed debate, but travel was teaching him another skill: the importance of observation. As the days passed, the motorcycle demanded constant repairs until it finally surrendered altogether. Without La Poderosa, the journey slowed dramatically. They walked, accepted rides from truck drivers, boarded overcrowded boats, worked odd jobs. Sometimes they simply followed whatever road lay ahead. Losing the motorcycle unexpectedly changed the character of the expedition. It was no longer an adventurous ride across a continent. It became an intimate encounter with it. Without speed, there was time to notice details that hurried travelers often missed. Children playing barefoot in dusty villages. Families rebuilding homes with whatever materials they could find. Endless fields owned by a handful of landowners, while laborers worked from sunrise until darkness. Crossing into Peru deepened Ernesto's reflections. The country carried visible reminders of civilizations that had flourished long before European conquest. Yet alongside magnificent remnants of the Inca world existed communities living in profound poverty. Many indigenous families remained isolated from political and economic power. Centuries had passed. Empires had risen and fallen. Governments had changed. But inequality often seemed remarkably persistent. For Ernesto, this realization was unsettling. Different flags flew over different capitals. Different presidents made different speeches. Yet ordinary people frequently carried the same burdens. He began thinking less in terms of individual nations and more in terms of a shared Latin American experience. The borders on maps suddenly appeared less important than the problems repeated on either side of them. The journey had started as an adventure. Quietly, almost without either traveler noticing, it was becoming something else. It was becoming an education, one that no university could have offered. As Ernesto and Alberto continued north, the journey gradually became less about distance and more about understanding. One place, however, would remain with Ernesto for the rest of his life: the San Pablo leper colony, deep in the Peruvian Amazon. For a young medical student, it was an opportunity to observe disease firsthand. For Ernesto, it became something far more personal. The patients lived apart from the outside world, separated not only by the river, but also by fear and prejudice. Many had been abandoned by relatives. Others had not touched another human being in years. Ernesto refused to see them as untouchable. He spoke with them, shared meals, played football, laughed, and, perhaps most memorably, greeted patients without wearing protective gloves whenever it was medically appropriate, believing dignity could be as important as treatment. The gesture later became part of his legend. Whether remembered with perfect accuracy or softened by memory, it reflected something genuine about the young doctor. He believed suffering should never strip a person of humanity. During evenings, conversations often stretched long after sunset. The Amazon flowed quietly nearby while patients, doctors, and travelers exchanged stories about illness, family, hope, and disappointment. Those conversations stayed with Ernesto long after the journey ended. The road had shown him poverty. San Pablo showed him exclusion. Together they formed a larger picture. As the expedition continued through Colombia and toward Venezuela, Ernesto increasingly stopped thinking like a tourist. He was beginning to think like someone searching for a pattern. Everywhere he looked, the details changed. The accents were different. The flags were different. The governments carried different names, yet the same questions returned again and again. Why did so much wealth exist beside such deep poverty? Why were indigenous communities still pushed to the margins centuries after independence? Why did workers seem to create prosperity they would never enjoy themselves? The more he traveled, the less convincing national borders appeared. Maps divided countries. Reality often did not. The travel diaries from these months reveal a young man still discovering his own political language. He could be romantic, impatient, idealistic, sometimes naive, sometimes remarkably perceptive. He had not yet become the disciplined revolutionary history remembers. That transformation still lay ahead, but the direction had begun to reveal itself. Medicine could heal one patient at a time. Increasingly, Ernesto wondered whether entire societies could also be healed. It was an ambitious thought, perhaps an impossible one. Yet once the question entered his mind, it refused to leave. When the journey finally came to an end, Ernesto returned home carrying far more than memories. He returned with notebooks filled with observations, with friendships strengthened by shared hardship, with a deeper understanding of Latin America than any classroom could have provided. Most importantly, he returned with a growing conviction that the continent's problems were connected. The road had not given him complete answers. It had given him better questions. Soon he would receive his medical degree. Soon he would leave Argentina once again, and in Guatemala, history would place before him an event that transformed those questions into convictions. There, for the first time, Ernesto Guevara would witness a revolution being undone, and nothing about his view of the world would ever be quite the same again. After earning his medical degree in 1953, Ernesto Guevara could have settled into a predictable career. Instead, he packed his belongings once again and continued north, convinced that his education was incomplete. Books had taught him anatomy. The road had taught him inequality. Now history itself was about to become his teacher. His next destination was Guatemala. At the time, Guatemala stood at the center of one of the most important political experiments in Latin America. President Jacobo Arbenz had come to power through democratic elections and promised reforms designed to modernize the country. The most ambitious of these was land reform, redistributing unused estates to thousands of landless farmers. To many Guatemalans, it represented hope. To powerful landowners and foreign business interests, it represented danger. Among the companies watching events with growing concern was the United Fruit Company, whose influence reached far beyond plantations. Land, transport, ports, and politics had become deeply intertwined. Ernesto arrived not as a politician, but as an observer. He spent long evenings talking with students, journalists, labor organizers, refugees, and intellectuals who believed Latin America stood at a crossroads. In cafes and modest apartments, conversations stretched late into the night. They spoke about colonialism, land, sovereignty, and the growing shadow of the Cold War. One of the most important people he met was Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist with a deep interest in Marxist thought, intelligent, politically engaged, and well-connected among Latin America's exiled activists. She introduced Ernesto to books, discussions, and circles that broadened his understanding of revolutionary theory. She did not create his political beliefs, but she helped give language to ideas that had already begun forming during his travels. Then history accelerated. In 1954, a CIA-backed operation supported the overthrow of Arbenz. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas emerged as the new leader, and Guatemala's reform movement collapsed with startling speed. For many around the world, the event became another chapter in Cold War politics. For Ernesto, it became deeply personal. He watched a government attempting reform fall before it could complete its program. He saw fear replace optimism. Friends disappeared into exile. Others were arrested. Some simply vanished from public life. Years later, historians would continue debating the many forces behind Guatemala's crisis: strategic calculations, corporate interests, regional politics, and the wider confrontation between Washington and Moscow. Ernesto did not experience those events as a historian. He experienced them as a witness. The lesson he carried away was simple, powerful, and ultimately life-changing. If peaceful reform could be overturned so quickly, then perhaps peaceful reform alone would never be enough. It was not a conclusion everyone shared. Many people who witnessed Guatemala drew very different lessons. Ernesto chose another path. His belief in gradual political change began giving way to a conviction that revolutions needed not only ideals, but the means to defend themselves. The young doctor who had once hoped to heal individuals was beginning to imagine healing societies through far more radical methods. As Guatemala became increasingly dangerous, Ernesto sought refuge in the Argentine embassy before eventually making his way to Mexico City. He left Guatemala carrying very little: a few possessions, a medical degree, several notebooks, and a conviction that would shape the rest of his life. He still did not know exactly where that conviction would lead, but in Mexico, fate was preparing an unexpected meeting. There, an ambitious Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro was gathering a small group of men who believed they could overthrow a dictatorship. Before long, Ernesto Guevara would no longer be simply a traveler. He would become a revolutionary. Mexico City was filled with political exiles, dreamers, and men who believed history had not yet finished speaking. It was there that Ernesto Guevara met Raul Castro, and soon afterward, Fidel Castro. Their first conversation reportedly lasted through much of the night. Fidel spoke of Cuba, of Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship, of corruption, censorship, and political violence. Most of all, he spoke with complete confidence that a small expedition could return to Cuba and ignite a revolution. Many would have dismissed the idea as impossible. Ernesto did not. The lessons of Guatemala were still fresh in his mind. He had watched reform collapse under external pressure. Fidel was offering something entirely different, not reform, but revolution. By sunrise, the Argentine doctor had agreed to join a Cuban movement that was not yet an army, but an idea. Training began quietly in Mexico. The volunteers learned to march, shoot, navigate rough terrain, and survive with very little. Ernesto had joined as the expedition's physician, responsible for treating wounds and illness. Yet, as the weeks passed, everyone noticed something else about him. He trained as hard as anyone. Asthma still followed him, but he rarely allowed it to become an excuse. Friends remembered nights when violent coughing fits left him exhausted, only for him to appear at morning drills refusing special treatment. In late November 1956, 82 men crowded aboard the aging yacht Granma. Designed for far fewer passengers, the vessel struggled beneath their combined weight. The crossing from Mexico to Cuba was miserable. Seasickness spread quickly. Food became scarce. Water was limited. Storms slowed their progress. What had been planned as a coordinated landing arrived days behind schedule. The delay proved costly. On December 2nd, 1956, the exhausted expedition reached Cuba under chaotic conditions. Before the group could organize itself, Batista's forces struck. The landing quickly turned into disaster. Gunfire scattered the rebels into swamps, mangroves, and dense vegetation. Many were killed. Many were captured. For a brief moment, it seemed the revolution had ended almost as soon as it had begun. Only a small number survived, separated, hungry, and carrying little more than their rifles. They slowly found one another again in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Those mountains became far more than a hiding place. They became a school, a refuge, and eventually the birthplace of a revolution. Life there was harsh. Rain-soaked clothing for days. Food was uncertain. Medical supplies were scarce. Every campfire risked revealing their position. Every unfamiliar sound in the forest demanded caution. Ernesto quickly discovered that the war would not allow him to remain only a doctor. One moment he was treating infected wounds. The next he was carrying ammunition. Soon afterward, he was fighting alongside the very men he had been sent to protect. Gradually, Fidel entrusted him with greater responsibility, not because he was Cuban, not because he sought power, but because he demonstrated remarkable discipline under pressure. Comrades described him as calm during combat, demanding in daily life, and relentless toward himself. The mountains also revealed another side of his personality. Ernesto believed that a guerrilla force could survive only through strict discipline. Informers, deserters, those believed to be endangering the movement. He accepted severe punishments, including executions in certain cases. Supporters later argued that such decisions were unavoidable in a war against a brutal dictatorship. Critics answered that they revealed an increasingly uncompromising view of revolutionary justice. The debate continues to this day. What remains beyond dispute is that the Sierra Maestra transformed Ernesto Guevara forever. He had arrived carrying a medical bag. He was becoming a commander. Outside the mountains, Batista still controlled the cities. Inside them, a small rebel force was quietly learning how to survive, organize, and slowly turn hope into military reality. With each passing month, more volunteers found their way into the Sierra Maestra. The movement was still fragile, yet for the first time, victory no longer seemed impossible. Far to the west, another chapter of the revolution was already waiting, and before long, Ernesto Guevara would lead men into one of the campaigns that changed Cuban history forever. By 1958, the balance of the Cuban Revolution had begun to shift. What had once seemed like a desperate band of fugitives hiding in the Sierra, Maestra was slowly becoming an organized fighting force. Batista's army still possessed more soldiers, heavier weapons, and control of the country's largest cities. Yet victories were becoming harder for the government to claim. Each successful guerrilla operation inspired new recruits. Each military failure weakened confidence in Batista's rule. Ernesto Guevara, now widely known simply as Che, had become one of Fidel Castro's most trusted commanders. He no longer carried only medical supplies. He carried responsibility. Late in 1958, Che received one of the most important assignments of the entire revolution: lead a column west, advance across the island, cut government supply lines, and prepare for a decisive confrontation. The march was long and exhausting. The guerrillas crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and moved through farmland where every encounter with local communities mattered. Some villagers offered food, shelter, or information. Others remained cautious, uncertain who would ultimately win the war. Winning battles required more than rifles. It required trust. As the column approached the city of Santa Clara, the revolution reached its defining moment. Santa Clara stood at the heart of Cuba. If the city fell, Batista's control over the island would begin collapsing with it. Government forces prepared their defenses. Among their strongest advantages was an armored train carrying soldiers, ammunition, and heavy equipment. For Batista's commanders, it represented security. For Che, it represented an opportunity. Rather than confronting superior firepower directly, the guerrillas disrupted the railway line, forcing the train off its tracks. Confusion spread quickly. Cut off from support and surrounded by determined fighters, many of the soldiers surrendered. The fall of the armored train quickly became one of the most famous episodes of the Cuban Revolution. It also became one of the defining images of Che Guevara's military career. News of Santa Clara traveled rapidly across Cuba. Confidence inside Batista's government began to disappear. In the early hours of January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled the country. The dictatorship had collapsed. For the rebels, years of sacrifice, hardship, and uncertainty had ended in victory. A week later, Fidel Castro entered Havana. Crowds filled the streets. Flags waved above balconies. For many Cubans, it felt like the beginning of an entirely new chapter in their nation's history. Yet revolutions often discover that winning power is easier than governing it. The coalition that had opposed Batista included people with very different dreams for Cuba. Some hoped for constitutional democracy. Others demanded sweeping social reform. Many simply wanted an end to corruption and political violence. Che belonged to another current. He believed removing Batista was only the beginning, without transforming the country's economic and social foundations. He feared the revolution would eventually recreate the very inequalities it had promised to destroy. That conviction shaped everything that followed. In the first months after victory, the revolutionary government moved quickly. The old army was dismantled. Land reform began. Former officials faced revolutionary tribunals. Institutions that had served the previous regime were rapidly transformed. For supporters, these changes represented justice delayed. For critics, they marked the beginning of a new concentration of power. Che soon assumed responsibility at La Cabana fortress, where revolutionary courts examined cases connected to Batista's security forces. The dictatorship had left behind a painful legacy of torture, disappearances, and political killings. Many families demanded accountability. Many also demanded punishment. The revolutionary leadership argued that the trials were necessary to prevent revenge from spreading through the country and to hold those responsible for serious crimes accountable. Others questioned whether justice carried out in the aftermath of revolution could ever be fully impartial. Executions took place. The precise number remains debated by historians. Responsibility has been interpreted differently by supporters and critics for decades. What is certain is that Che accepted the use of capital punishment as a legitimate instrument of revolutionary justice. It remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. For admirers, it reflected the harsh realities of dismantling a violent dictatorship. For opponents, it revealed how easily revolutionary certainty could become political intolerance. The debate has never truly ended. As Cuba entered a new era, Che himself entered another transformation. The guerrilla commander who had spent years sleeping beneath trees and crossing mountains, with little more than a backpack, now found himself walking through government offices. The revolution had won. Now it faced a far more complicated challenge. How do you build the society you have spent years fighting to create? That question would soon lead Che from the battlefield into the heart of government itself. The rifles had grown silent. For the first time in years, Che Guevara's days were no longer measured by marches through mountains or the sound of distant gunfire. Instead, they were filled with meetings, reports, factories, ministries, and difficult decisions. The revolution had succeeded. Now it had to govern. History often celebrates the dramatic moment when a government falls. Far less attention is given to what comes afterward. Winning a revolution is one challenge. Building a nation is another entirely. Che accepted that challenge with the same intensity he had shown as a guerrilla commander. He became a Cuban citizen, worked within the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, later served as president of the National Bank, and eventually became Minister of Industries. To many observers, the appointment seemed unusual. After all, he was a doctor by training, not an economist, not a banker. Yet Fidel Castro valued something beyond technical expertise. He trusted Che's discipline, loyalty, and willingness to place ideology before personal ambition. One small gesture became famous. When Cuban banknotes required a signature, Che simply signed them. Some interpreted it as humor. Others saw quiet contempt for money itself. Whether symbolic or practical, it reflected a larger belief. Che argued that capitalism encouraged people to think primarily about personal gain. A socialist society, he believed, required something fundamentally different, not simply new institutions, new people. He often spoke about what he called the new man. In his vision, citizens would work not because higher wages demanded it, but because they believed their labor served society as a whole. Volunteer work became an important symbol of that idea. Even after long days in government offices, Che could often be found helping cut sugarcane, unloading cargo, or working alongside factory employees. He expected leaders to share the same sacrifices they asked of everyone else. Friends and political allies admired this quality deeply. He lived modestly, worked relentlessly, avoided many of the comforts usually associated with political power. His personal discipline was rarely questioned, yet governing demanded more than discipline. It demanded difficult economic choices. Cuba faced enormous pressure. Relations with the United States deteriorated rapidly. Trade became increasingly restricted. The island remained heavily dependent on sugar exports while attempting to diversify its economy. Experienced managers business owners, and professionals left the country in significant numbers. Meanwhile, the government sought to reorganize nearly every major institution at once. Che approached these challenges with remarkable confidence. Sometimes that confidence inspired others. Sometimes it underestimated reality. He believed moral commitment could become a powerful economic force. Critics argued that factories also required incentives, technical knowledge, investment, and practical management. Supporters answered that no revolutionary society could be built if people continued thinking exactly as they had under capitalism. It became more than an economic disagreement. It became a debate about human nature itself. Could education transform behavior? Could ideals replace financial motivation? Could sacrifice become a permanent foundation for society? Che believed the answer was yes. History would prove far more complicated. Despite growing economic difficulties, the revolution also introduced profound social changes. Literacy campaigns expanded education across the island. Medical services reached communities that had long received little government attention. Official rhetoric increasingly challenged old racial and class divisions that had shaped Cuban society for generations. Many Cubans remembered these years as a period of genuine social transformation. Others experienced them very differently. Independent political space narrowed. Opposition voices found fewer places to speak openly. The revolutionary government increasingly viewed disagreement not simply as criticism, but as a possible threat to the revolution itself. Che shared much of that outlook. He believed the revolution remained surrounded by enemies both inside and outside Cuba. From his perspective, unity was essential for survival. Critics warned that emergencies, once accepted as permanent, could gradually justify the concentration of political power. The tension never disappeared. Che's own life reflected that contradiction. He sincerely opposed privilege, yet he also accepted a political system that allowed little room for organized dissent. He dreamed of liberation, yet he placed enormous faith in discipline. The revolutionary who had once fought against authority was now helping build a new state, one that expected loyalty, sacrifice, and ideological commitment from its citizens. Outside Cuba, the Cold War was becoming increasingly dangerous. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 confirmed fears that the United States was willing to support efforts to overthrow the revolutionary government. Only a year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. For many governments, the crisis ended with relief. For Che, it left a different impression. Small nations, he believed, could easily become bargaining pieces in struggles between great powers. His attention gradually shifted beyond Cuba itself. If revolution had succeeded on one island, could it spread elsewhere? The question would soon pull him away from ministerial offices and conference tables. Before long, Che Guevara would once again leave behind the safety of government. The mountains were calling him back. Only this time, they would not be in Cuba. By the mid-1960s, Che Guevara had become one of the most recognizable faces of the Cuban Revolution. He traveled across the socialist world, through Africa, Asia, and Latin America, representing Cuba in meetings that reached far beyond the Caribbean. Presidents welcomed him. Diplomats listened carefully. Journalists followed his every movement. Yet behind the official ceremonies, something had begun to change. Government life no longer satisfied him. He had not crossed mountains and survived war simply to spend the rest of his life behind a desk. For Che, revolution was never meant to remain inside the borders of a single country. He believed in justice connected continents, just as surely as oceans separated them. In speeches delivered abroad, He argued that newly independent nations still struggled under economic dependence, foreign intervention, and political pressure. Colonial empires were fading, but in his eyes, new forms of domination had replaced them. His words carried unusual weight because they came from someone who had fought, governed, and willingly accepted personal sacrifice. At the United Nations in 1964, Che spoke with open defiance against imperialism and defended Cuba's right to determine its own future. To supporters, he became a powerful voice for countries that felt ignored by the world's great powers. To critics, his speeches reflected an uncompromising revolutionary vision that left little room for political pluralism. His disagreements were not limited to the West. Che also grew increasingly frustrated with the Soviet Union. Although Cuba depended heavily on Soviet support, he believed Moscow had become too cautious, too bureaucratic, and too willing to treat poorer nations through the language of economics rather than solidarity. He admired discipline, but he feared comfort. He admired planning, but distrusted routine. Above all, he believed revolutions lost their purpose the moment they stopped taking risks. In Algeria, he publicly challenged both capitalist and socialist countries, arguing that the developing world deserved more than speeches and strategic alliances. Around the same time, another conflict deeply shaped his thinking: Vietnam. As the war intensified, Che watched a smaller nation resist one of the world's most powerful militaries. To him, Vietnam represented more than a battlefield. It became proof that determined people could force even the strongest powers into long and costly wars. His famous call to create many Vietnams reflected that conviction. It was not a metaphor for peaceful protest. It was a call for armed revolutionary struggle across multiple continents. For supporters, it symbolized international solidarity. For opponents, it revealed how completely Che had embraced violence as a political instrument. At the center of this vision stood one of his most influential ideas: the guerrilla foco. Che argued that revolutionary conditions did not always have to exist before an uprising began. A small, disciplined guerrilla force, he believed, could inspire broader resistance and help create those very conditions. The theory was bold. It inspired young revolutionaries across Latin America, Africa, and beyond. Yet it also carried enormous risks. Not every country was Cuba. Not every dictatorship resembled Batista's, and not every rural population was waiting for armed revolution. Che nevertheless remained convinced that history favored those willing to act before circumstances appeared perfect. By 1965, he reached a remarkable decision. He quietly disappeared from public life. Rumors spread throughout Cuba. Had he fallen ill? Had he broken with Fidel Castro? Had he been sent on a secret diplomatic mission? Months later, Fidel answered those questions by reading a farewell letter written by Che himself. In it, Che renounced his government positions. He surrendered his military rank. He even gave up his Cuban citizenship, not because he rejected Cuba, but because he believed his duty now lay elsewhere. He intended to fight wherever he believed revolution still needed him. For many observers, the decision seemed almost impossible to understand. He was leaving influence, leaving security, leaving international prestige, and choosing uncertainty once again. His next destination would surprise many. It was not South America, it was Central Africa. There, in the newly independent Congo, Che hoped to ignite another revolution. He carried with him the confidence born in the Sierra Maestra. History, however, was preparing a very different lesson. When Che Guevara quietly disappeared from public life in 1965, much of the world wondered where he had gone. The answer lay thousands of miles from Havana, Hidden beneath a false identity, he had traveled to the eastern Congo, believing Africa might become the next great front in the global struggle against colonialism and foreign domination. The Congo seemed, at least from a distance, to offer everything his revolutionary theory required: a country emerging from colonial rule, political instability, armed resistance, foreign intervention, and people who had suffered years of exploitation. To Che, the conditions appeared familiar. History, however, rarely repeats itself so neatly. The Congo was not Cuba. Its conflicts reached deep into local histories, ethnic divisions, regional rivalries, and the unfinished legacy of Belgian colonial rule. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba had already become a symbol of Cold War intervention, while competing factions struggled to define the country's future. Che arrived with a small group of Cuban volunteers. Their mission was not to conquer territory. It was to train, advise, and strengthen rebel forces already fighting on the ground. From the beginning, reality proved far more complicated than expectation. Communication was difficult. Supplies arrived irregularly. Disease spread through the camps. Leadership among the rebel groups was often divided. Plans changed without warning. Some fighters displayed remarkable courage. Others disappeared before battles even began. Che filled his notebooks with careful observations. He admired determination wherever he found it. Yet he also wrote candidly about indiscipline, poor organization, and the difficulty of building trust among groups that did not always share the same priorities. For perhaps the first time since Cuba, he confronted an uncomfortable possibility. Revolution could not simply be exported. The methods that had succeeded in the Sierra Maestra did not automatically succeed somewhere else. Local history mattered, culture mattered, language mattered. The confidence born in Cuba slowly gave way to frustration. Illness returned. The tropical climate exhausted the Cubans. Malaria, shortages, and constant uncertainty wore down morale. Meanwhile, government forces, foreign advisors, and hired mercenaries steadily increased the pressure on the rebels. The campaign never found the momentum Che had imagined. Looking back years later, many historians would describe the Congo expedition as one of the greatest failures of his life. Che himself reached much the same conclusion. In his private writings, he admitted that determination alone could not overcome every obstacle. The experience challenged one of his deepest beliefs. Courage remained essential, but courage could not replace local legitimacy. Nor could revolutionary enthusiasm erase political realities that outsiders barely understood. Eventually, the decision became unavoidable. The Cuban mission withdrew. There would be no victory, no triumphant return, only another difficult lesson. Failure, however, did not convince Che to abandon his ideals. If anything, it strengthened his resolve to try again. He believed the problem lay not in the dream itself, but in the place where he had attempted to realize it. Soon his attention returned to South America. One country in particular seemed to offer another opportunity: Bolivia. Situated near the heart of the continent, it appeared capable of becoming the spark that might spread revolution across national borders. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps the most ambitious of his life, and it would become his final campaign. By late 1966, Che Guevara had returned to South America in complete secrecy, using a false identity and a carefully altered appearance. He entered Bolivia believing the country could become the center of a continental revolution. Surrounded by Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Paraguay, Bolivia appeared to offer a strategic position unlike any other. On a map, the plan seemed convincing. On the ground, reality was far less accommodating. Che established a small guerrilla camp in the remote Noncajosa region alongside Cuban, Bolivian, and international volunteers. They hoped to build local support gradually before expanding their operations. Instead, problems appeared almost immediately. The Bolivian Communist Party disagreed with Che over leadership and strategy. Urban support networks struggled to function. Communication became unreliable. Supplies were scarce. The countryside that had once seemed full of revolutionary possibility remained cautious. Many local peasants did not view the guerrillas as liberators. Some feared government reprisals. Others simply did not believe these armed strangers represented their interests. Che's theory had always depended upon a small revolutionary force inspiring broader resistance. In Bolivia, that spark never became a fire. Life in the mountains grew increasingly difficult. Food ran short. Boots wore out. Medicine became precious. Che's asthma, which had followed him since childhood, returned with relentless force. Long marches through rugged valleys often ended with violent coughing fits, yet he refused to abandon the campaign. His diary from Bolivia offers a remarkably honest portrait of those months. Rather than heroic speeches, it records missed opportunities, broken radio equipment, exhausted comrades, dwindling supplies, and the daily struggle to keep hope alive. Even as conditions worsened, he continued analyzing every setback with the discipline of a commander and the curiosity of a student. Meanwhile, the Bolivian army adapted quickly, with training, intelligence, and logistical assistance from the United States. Government forces steadily improved their ability to track the guerrillas. Declassified records later confirmed that American officials followed the campaign closely, recognizing both Che's symbolic importance and the consequences his defeat might have for revolutionary movements elsewhere. Even so, the campaign cannot be understood simply as Che versus the CIA. Bolivian officers made their own decisions. Bolivian soldiers fought the battles. Bolivian civilians lived with the consequences. The conflict belonged first to Bolivia itself. As the months passed, the guerrilla column steadily shrank. Some fighters were killed. Others became separated in the dense landscape. Every loss made survival more difficult. By October 1967, the campaign had become less an expanding revolution than a desperate struggle to remain alive. On October 8th, government forces surrounded Che's group near the Quebrada del Euro. During the firefight, he was wounded and captured alive. His rifle had reportedly been damaged. His escape routes had vanished. The long journey that had begun years earlier on the roads of South America ended in a narrow ravine in Bolivia. He was taken to the small village of La Higuera and confined inside a simple schoolhouse. There, tired, injured, and suffering from asthma, he waited under armed guard while officials debated what should happen next. The following day, orders arrived from the Bolivian High Command. There would be no public trial. Che Guevara was executed on October 9th, 1967. The decision ended the campaign. It also created something its authors had hoped to avoid: a martyr. His body was transported to Valle Grande, where journalists, soldiers, and local residents were allowed to see it. The photographs taken there spread rapidly around the world. To some observers, the images resembled classical paintings of sacrifice. To others, they confirmed only that another revolutionary war had come to a violent end. His hands were removed for fingerprint identification. His burial place remained secret for decades. Yet despite every effort to control the narrative, the man had already begun becoming a legend. His final campaign had failed. The revolution he hoped to ignite in Bolivia never came. But history was about to give Che Guevara a different kind of victory. Not on the battlefield, but in memory. Che Guevara's final battle ended in a small Bolivian schoolhouse. His story, however, did not. In many ways, it was only beginning. After his execution, Bolivian authorities transported his body to the nearby town of Valle. There, journalists, soldiers, doctors, and curious residents gathered to witness the death of a man whose name had already traveled far beyond Latin America. The photographs taken that day would become some of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. His eyes were closed. His beard remained untouched. His body rested upon a simple concrete wash basin. To some observers, the scene carried an almost religious quality, recalling classical paintings of sacrifice. Others saw only the inevitable end of another failed guerrilla campaign. History, as it often does, refused to settle on a single interpretation. His hands were removed so that fingerprints could confirm his identity. His body disappeared into a secret grave whose location remained unknown for decades. The intention was clear. Without a grave, perhaps there could be no pilgrimage. Without a body, perhaps there could be no legend. Yet legends rarely depend upon graves. In 1997, remains believed to be those of Che and several of his companions were recovered near Valle Grande and returned to Cuba, where they were reburied in Santa Clara, the city forever linked to one of his greatest military victories. By then, however, the historical Che Guevara had already begun giving way to something larger, an image, a symbol, an idea. The transformation owed much to a photograph taken years earlier. In March 1960, Cuban photographer Alberto Corda captured Che standing quietly during a memorial ceremony in Havana. At the time, it was simply one photograph among many. Only after Che's death did it begin its extraordinary journey. The image was cropped, copied, printed, painted, reproduced across continents until it became one of the most recognizable portraits ever created. Few photographs have traveled so far. Fewer still have carried so many different meanings. One of history's great ironies soon emerged. A man who criticized consumer culture became one of the world's most commercialized faces. His portrait appeared on posters, t-shirts, flags, coffee mugs, murals, album covers, university dormitories, protest banners, souvenirs, and advertisements. Sometimes it represented genuine political conviction, sometimes youthful rebellion, sometimes national identity, sometimes little more than fashion. The symbol had escaped the man, yet behind every reproduction remained a far more complicated human being. A doctor who crossed a continent searching for answers. A revolutionary who believed in justice, demanded action. A commander who accepted violence as part of political struggle. A government minister who tried to build a new society. A critic of imperialism who also helped construct a state that allowed little room for political opposition. A man admired for personal sacrifice and criticized for political intolerance. Reducing such a life to either hero or villain ultimately tells us very little. His admirers point toward literacy campaigns, expanded healthcare, anti-colonial solidarity, and a willingness to risk everything for deeply held convictions. His critics point toward revolutionary tribunals, executions, one-party rule, and an enduring belief that noble ends could justify harsh means. Both perspectives emerge from the historical record. Neither completely explains the man. Perhaps that is why Che Guevara continues to provoke such powerful reactions. He forces uncomfortable questions. Can violence create justice? Can revolutions remain humane after taking power? Can equality survive without freedom? Can freedom survive without equality? These questions extend far beyond Cuba. They continue to echo wherever societies struggle with inequality. Foreign influence, authoritarian rule, or the slow pace of political reform. Che never found final answers. History has not found them either. Perhaps that is his true legacy. Not certainty, but debate. Not a finished conclusion, but an unfinished conversation. Today, more than half a century after his death, millions recognize his face without knowing the roads he traveled, the books he read, the patients he treated, the battles he fought, the governments he helped build, or the contradictions that shaped every stage of his remarkable life. The icon is familiar, the man is far less so, and perhaps remembering that difference is the most important lesson his story can offer. History does not give us Che Guevara as an answer. It gives us a question about ideals, about power, about sacrifice, about violence, about hope, and about the difficult choices people make when they become convinced they are changing the world. Thank you for joining this journey through one of the 20th century's most fascinating and controversial lives. If you enjoyed this calm exploration of history, consider joining us again as we continue discovering the people, places, and moments that shaped our world one quiet story at a time.